Hello there, and welcome to everyone joining us for this latest IoT Central webinar. I'm Clive Maxfield, everyone calls me Max, and I'll be your host. In addition to being a practicing engineer myself, I also act as a technology consultant, author, speaker, and educator. I'd like to start our webinar by thanking Spindance for sponsoring today's event. Spindance is a leading supporter of the IoT Central community, and we're grateful to have them as sponsors. Today's webinar is entitled Accelerating IoT, the fastest way to an MVP. Before we begin, I'd like to briefly review the format of today's proceedings. The event will be 1 hour long. We have one presenter who I'll introduce in just a moment, and there'll be a Q&A session after the presentation. Please feel free to ask any questions at any time during the presentation using the questions feature in the control panel, and I will be posing these questions on your behalf during the Q&A portion of today's event. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce today's speaker. Daniel Like is the product owner at Spindance. Take it away.
All right, thank you, Max. It's good to be with you today. Like was mentioned, I'm a product owner here at Spindance, which means that I help work with our clients to figure out what they're building and why. And then I oftentimes find myself as a bridge between the clients and stakeholders and the development team as they work to execute towards that vision. One of the things that I've learned over the last years is how important MVPs can be in the development process. And so I'm excited to talk to you today about that. So just in case you aren't familiar with Spindance, let me give you a really quick introduction and then we'll kind of move on from this. So we're a software development consultancy. We are focused on the Internet of Things almost exclusively. We've been in business for about 20 years. We do mostly custom software development. That's our primary service, and most of the work that we do falls into that category. But we do also do training and consulting services as well. Basically, we do everything that our customers need us to do in order to help them define and develop their IoT products and platforms. We work with lots of different kinds of organizations, including startups and Fortune 500 companies. We run our projects using an agile development methodology, which I imagine many of you do as well. So we've improved and refined that process through many projects over the years. Yep, and I've seen firsthand the power that iterative development can bring to a product development process, especially when we're talking about things that are fairly complex, like a connected product in the IoT space. So today we're going to take a closer look at how we can use MVPs to accelerate product development process, thinking particular, obviously, about the IoT context today. So just a quick look at where we're headed today. First, we'll look at how we define what an MVP even is and what it isn't. We'll get into talking about how we design an MVP product and then some strategies for how we would build an MVP, and then conclude with how we leverage an MVP to move forward. And of course, like Max said, we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. So first, we'll take a quick look at what an MVP is. It's a term that gets used a lot in many different ways in different contexts. And so we should align on it, what it means, at least for the context of today's conversation. There are many ways to describe what an MVP could be. You can find lots of different definitions with lots of different nuances, but I actually kind of like how Eric Ries defines it. And that's that version of a product which allows a team to collect a maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. If I can nitpick just one thing in his definition, I would replace customers with users or something like that. Because in my view, not all of our products and work need to be strictly viewed in terms of what someone might pay, but maybe more in terms of the value that we can create for them. But I come at this primarily from a product perspective, not a business one. So there are probably people who disagree. So let's build on that a little bit. The goal of an MVP is learning. It's a test case for hypotheses, and it's targeted at a specific set of users, which we'll dig into that more in a little bit. An MVP is not necessarily the first production version of a product. It's not just a product with a limited feature set. and it's oftentimes or largely not designed for public launch or broad adoption. Examples of great MVP products on the web are fairly easy to find. Airbnb is a classic example of an MVP product. The founders used MVPs aggressively to test the core assumptions of the product before they really started any kind of significant development. The first assumption they were testing, or the first core hypothesis they were trying to confirm, was, will people stay at a stranger's home or apartment? And so they developed a very simple prototype, MVP, to test that with a very targeted group of people. Building on that, they went actually just second MVP when they designed to test the second core question, which is, will people be willing to host strangers in their own apartment and or homes? And the second version was really designed around that host experience. Can they attract hosts to this platform? Because they answered the first question, the answer was yes, strangers would pay. The second hypothesis is, will people offer their places to stay? As you can see, there's not really much here in the way of UX. It's not feature rich. It's very simple and it is designed for learning. So after countless iterations and revisions, this is what the site looks like today, or one piece of the site. There's actually many facets now to this product, but it looks completely different and has lots of features and functionality that the original ones didn't have. But they're still built on that foundational lessons that they learned during the first two MVP versions. If they would have tried to go straight to building this version, they almost certainly would have failed. It would have been way too costly, and they would have failed to make the right design decisions without the necessary input and feedback from users and stakeholders along the way. Examples of MVPs in IoT are arguably a little bit harder to find, but let's look at a recent project example as an example. So at Spindance, we get to work across lots of industries, which is really a lot of fun because we get to learn about all kinds of different things along the way as we apply IoT expertise to that problem space. And one of the recent projects that I think is a good example of how to use an MVP to accelerate a product development was called Seagull. Our client in this case was GLOS, it's Great Lakes Observing Systems. They're a nonprofit organization that rolls up under NOAA as part of the federal government. And they're tasked with collecting and maintaining access to public scientific marine data, in their case specifically about the Great Lakes. So we were brought in to help them architect and build a new IoT platform to collect a very large diversity of different types of data, including real-time data from buoys and other scientific equipment that are deployed in the lakes in this region. So, and then to process, serve, and store that data, and to do all that for a wide variety of user types, from scientists to recreational boaters to people who manage wastewater and clean water drinking plants, a large variety of users. So this was obviously a large project. So we broke it down into several phases, and the first of which was an MVP that resulted in a private beta test for a small group of their core users. They were handpicked and hand invited to the private beta test. So this MVP version lacked many features that we knew would be necessary in the final platform, like user accounts, real-time alerts, data visualizations, et cetera, et cetera. And we very strategically pulled forward features that we knew were higher risk technically, or that we really knew that we were going to need input from the community and from their users on to move forward well. As a quick side note, as we look at how we define and examples of an MVP, if you read a lot on the internet about product development, you might find the concept of an MVT, which is a minimum viable test. I'm not going to dig a lot into this today, but just know that it's another way of sort of defining an early product testing phase. And it can be helpful as a concept, especially if your organization has a predefined or pre-existing notion of an MVP. And especially if that's more product than minimal, then the term of a minimum viable test can be helpful sometimes in defining a even earlier test as we look to really accelerate things at the very beginning. So now we'll take a quick look at how we would design an MVP product strategy. So I think there are many important aspects here, but two that I'm going to focus on today are making things simple and making them targeted. So I'm going to use the word simple here as kind of a replacement for minimal, and I'm doing that really intentionally. If you look at the definition for minimal, the top definition especially is about making things small, reducing them to where they're negligible. Right or wrong, this is going to be a hard thing to strive for in a product development team, especially when we've got a team that's rallied around a product we really care about. Second definition, we see a little bit more of what we're looking for, simple in primary forms, etc. But I'd argue that minimum is really more of a state of being. Something either is minimal or it's not. Doesn't really make a good goal, especially when you look at rallying a team around and the hard decisions and conversations that have to happen in this process. So that's where I think making this substitution for simple maybe is helpful. If we look at the definition for simple, we see attributes that we can easily turn into actionable goals that the team can rally around. Easy to understand, emphasizing the fundamental and straightforward nature of something, uncomplicated in form, nature, and design. Maybe I'm being overly fussy here with words. I've been accused of that in the past, but I think that part of the challenge with any project, including and maybe especially an MVP phase, is learning how to communicate the nuances of what you're doing and what you're not doing. And I think words have an outsized influence on that sometimes in ways that we don't expect. So one of the key principles of agile development, which an MVP is very much like a piece of, is maximizing the amount of work not done. Another way to say that would be to keep things simple. So using an MVP approach is a great strategy towards that end. This is really an editorial function. You have to really edit carefully what you're building. And that's something that I see and have experienced a lot of teams struggling with. I think there's lots of reasons for that. I think people have a hard time saying no to people they work with and that they respect. It can be really personal, especially when the product teams are close knit and the product is something that the team really cares a lot about. It also, when a team starts to work through that process together of figuring out what's in and what's out, it can often lead to compromises, which is good. But oftentimes we see compromises being made that result in just doing more things, but doing less of each one. And that's really counterproductive for an MVP. You really want to get things simple and focused. So while defining features, so when defining an MVP, any features that isn't absolutely necessary to test one of the core hypotheses or strategies that you're testing should be pushed out to a later development phase. A lot of good ideas and features will get pushed out of an MVP. That's just the facts. Otherwise, it will be too big. Maybe a help strategy here is instead of considering it as saying no to a bunch of important features, it could be considered as protecting actually those ideas and features until the core assumptions have been validated and there's a solid base to build those ideas on. Ideas are really personal and you have to actively manage the team of contributors and stakeholders while protecting the MVP from being bloated. There's a really good reason that you want to keep an MVP simple, lots of reasons, but and one of those is that the honest truth is that most users don't use most features on any product. Most of you have likely heard of the 80-20 rule, and it is applied in lots of different contexts. It's famous in manufacturing quality control. It's also famous as an expression you might use to justify only putting in 20% of the work because you're going to get any percent of the benefit anyway. So after that, you'd be wasting your time. But it also applies to software in several different ways. First, the hardest 20% of your code will probably take your team 80% of the time to develop. And it's been shown that 80% of your users will only use about 20% of your features. So this is really critical to understand within the whole product development lifecycle, but it's really critical at MVP because launching MVP features won't contribute to learning is a waste. So let's say you launch an MVP product with 10 features. We'll call that nice and feature rich. We know that most of your users will probably only use 2 to 3 of those features, which means that the features you invested in, you're only going to get or for most of the features you invested in, you're going to get little to no actionable learning or insight. Even worse, most of those features will naturally get carried forward into your next iteration because you won't know what else to do with them. You didn't get any actionable insight, feedback. You don't know if they're good or bad. You don't know what value to provide, if any. And this has long-term consequences for your product. Every feature that you include increases long-term complexity, long-term costs, and likely contributes to very little value over the long term for your users and for your business. So every feature that you carry forward increases that risk and cost in subsequent development phases. So let's say instead that you launch a similar product, but with only 3 features. This is obviously, like we talked about, way harder. All the conversations that require telling people, I hear that, but we're not doing that yet. But not fun and a lot of work. But if you can do it, as your users start using the product, they will likely utilize most of the 3 features, because what else are they going to do? This will give you a much more focused feedback from your users, helping really confirm and deny those core hypotheses. You'll also likely, hopefully, see a lot of requests for a couple specific features to be added. And while some people might see this as a miss in the design process, well, you didn't anticipate those users wanting that, and so that's a miss. It's actually a good thing if you have that, because it gives you a really clear path to add features that your users actually want from your product, and it allows you to justify deprioritizing the rest of the features. We had this exact situation on the Seagull project that I mentioned before. We launched the MVP without a number of features that their legacy platform had. So we were replacing a legacy product. And we launched the MVP without some of the core features from that legacy product. And we did that knowing that we were going to get feedback, and we did. And the features that we were asked for, that many users asked for right away, we prioritized those and got them in the next release. We knew that they were already in our backlog. We knew they were going to be gaps. We saw the feedback that confirmed it. And so we finished those and got those out to users. But we didn't hear about all the missing features. And those missing features, which we never heard about, most of those are still chilling in our icebox at this point. We haven't had to invest any time or money in them. They don't make feature developments more complicated and more expensive. They don't add risk to the platform over time, et cetera, et cetera. So keeping things simple, absolutely critical. Keeping things targeted is probably equally important, especially in IoT. IoT products are particularly challenging, or I would say interesting in this regard, because they often have several, if not many, different types of users, which can make targeting an MVP particularly challenging. There are also some important dynamics to consider regarding how products are adopted by users over time. So we'll look at that as well. So a common dynamic that we find in IoT products is the need for design for multiple user personas. This is actually one of the things that I find most interesting about the IoT problem space at a very high level. Almost every IoT product or system has multiple types of user personas who may have very different use cases, expectations, and experiences with the system. So let's look at a couple examples. A simple coffee maker has a pretty straightforward group of users. It's people in pursuit of a cup of coffee, or maybe more honestly, caffeine, depending on the day. But let's take that same coffee maker and make it a connected product. We still have that main user persona, the person who wants to drink some coffee, but we now have a whole bunch of other potential users and personas and use cases. Some examples: the company who sold the coffee maker, they may want analytics or telematics, or they may want data from the device for service reasons, or to analyze which of their features are being used by users so they can better inform their product development cycle. What about companies who sell coffee or supplies? They would definitely be interested in data that was flowing off of the machines for product replacement, coffee subscriptions, you name it. Or even more complex kind of use case is maybe a hotel owner or manager who wants to deploy and manage a fleet of coffee makers and be able to see usage patterns or to be able to know when things need to be refreshed or changed, updated, when maybe they want to charge the room when you use a coffee maker. That sounds terrible, but something that somebody might want to do. So all these additional users add a lot of complexity, not only to their product design work as in general, but especially when you're trying to define an MVP. If we're thinking about an MVP as a tool for testing and learning, then we really have to be careful how the MVP we develop, we use. So if we design an MVP for an IoT coffee maker that is targeted at hotel managers, and then at the last minute, we try to include coffee suppliers in that MVP test round, we're not going to be successful with that because we won't have accounted for those use cases and personas in the design. So let's look at another example here. Maybe an industrial IoT product. IoT is not all consumer products, of course. Let's say this product connects real-time devices on the plant floor to engineers, managers, and other people who might need visibility or need to access that data for real-time reasons to improve plant efficiency, et cetera. So this is a perfect example when there's multiple user personas using the same system. Their actions may, in this case, even influence how other people experience the system. One user may need to do something in the system that may influence another user's use case. And they may not share even a common understanding of what the system is supposed to do or for. They may have completely different understandings of what the value of the system is. And this is a case where you're putting software between people. And anytime you do that, you have to be really intentional in understanding how that software is going to create either synergy or friction between those different groups of users, especially when you're thinking about how to make a simple targeted MVP to do learning. So kind of moving on here, many of you may be familiar with the concept of the product development, a product adoption curve. In any case, some context here, the technology adoption lifecycle is a sociological model that is an extension of an earlier method or model called the diffusion process, which was originally published in 1957. Originally, the purpose was to track the purchase of hybrid seed corn by farmers. So that's your interesting fact for the day. But it was adapted and popularized by Geoffrey Moore in his book, Crossing the Chasm, which many of you probably heard of or read. But the basic idea here is that products follow a relatively predictable pattern of adoption by users. It's based on a normal distribution, and it's broken down into stages based on the type of users who are adopting a product at any given time in the life cycle. So yeah, those would be innovators, moving on to early adopters. The early majority would be when the product is really coming into its own, being adopted more widely. Late majority are people who are picking it up because that's what's available, and then laggards are the kind of the users who come way at the tail end of the adoption, likely because there's not any other choice at that point. So the idea behind the chasm, which is that kind of piece between your innovators and your early adopters, is that there's a significant gap that you kind of have to jump between those two groups of users. There's likely a gap in understanding. Sometimes it's a technical gap. Sometimes innovators may be willing to tinker and mess with stuff, while the early adopters may be much less so, and early majority definitely not. It might be a gap in their kind of understanding of the problem that you're addressing. Innovators might actually have a similar vision or be able to understand the problem that you're trying to address more than like somebody in the late majority might just right from the baseline, which obviously changes the way that you would approach that group of people. There's also definitely a gap in expectations that users have. So as a product moves through this adoption curve, the expectations that users have for the product increase and consolidate dramatically. The consolidation of expectations really, it means that most users come to a fairly common understanding of what a product is supposed to do, how it behaves, what it's for, the problem it solves, and then like the attributes of it, like, what is its form factor, what are the main features of a particular product for that solution. So, and that consolidation of expectations really accelerates as the product gets adopted widely. And by the time you're talking about late majority, it's largely fully formed. This obviously, I think obviously can have huge implications on an MVP product and how it's perceived by your first users. So let's look at a couple examples here. How many people here have a smart light bulb? What about a smart shower head? I bet almost no one here has a connected shower head. I might be wrong, but it's probably very few, if any. And maybe that's because it's a bad product idea, or maybe it's just early in the adoption life cycle. On the other hand, I bet many of us have one or more smart light bulbs in our house or office. And even if you don't own them personally, you absolutely have a context for what a smart light bulb is, and you already have a lot of expectations about what it should do and shouldn't do and how it should work. So these two products are at like very different parts of the adoption curve. And I think it illustrates how much different an MVP approach should be with, depending on where the product is on this curve. So if we were launching a new smart light bulb, we need to understand that it is so far down the adoption curve that we would need to consider all of the existing expectations that users have in the market. If you brought me a smart light bulb that requires a provisioning app and a new hub and a bunch of messing around to get it to work, I'm going to throw that thing away. There's no way. My expectations are based on my most recent smart bulb purchase, Nanoleaf. It provisions with the iOS Home app in less than 60 seconds. There's no hub. There's no messing around. If you don't meet those expectations, you have no chance. On the other hand, if we were launching a new connected shower head, we would be targeting innovators with low and unconsolidated expectations. I also do not have a connected shower head, which makes sense for me because I'm not an innovator in that space, in that product. I don't really personally see the opportunity or the problem that I need to have solved, but there are definitely people who do, though. We could imagine some fairly easily. One might be somebody who's very conscious about saving water or measuring water usage. That would potentially be a use case, or temperature regulation. Or maybe it's a more accessible option for someone for whom mechanical controls don't work very well. There's a lot of potential reasons why someone in theory could or would be an innovator for a connected shower head product, or for any particular product. And when you're launching an MVP and it's early in the phase, those are your people. You need to find those people who are innovators and who understand the problem space and who can help you actually refine your product and move it forward. So as you consider all the variables at play in defining an MVP and helping decide what's in it and what your strategy is, deciding what type of MVP you're going to build can be really helpful. There are many ways to break this down. This is certainly not meant to be prescriptive. There was a paper published in a journal called Future Internet. They broke it down into these three categories, which I think this is a helpful mental model. So they call type 1 as a very low cost approach. You're validating early concepts. It's really focused on wireframing and these really kind of easy to create experiences. Type 2 is really focused on the core product features, like its form and its form factor, like what does this thing look and feel like? And the functionality might even be largely imaginary at that point. And then in type 3, you would see the integrations start to happen. Like what does this thing actually do and how does it do it? How does it function? And then these might fit into sort of a product development like path or project. And often a new product development can consist of multiple MVPs. It's very possible, especially if you're talking about type 1 and type 2s. You may do many of those before you kind of move sort of up the chain, if you will. But you may skip one of these steps. You may do some more than once. This is, again, not prescriptive, but you kind of move through these different processes. And type 1 is really like a small team can do it. You don't really need a lot of specialized skills likely to do that. You need vision and you need the products and you need to connect with users. Type 2, you're really starting to learn more or lean more into design and building something that actually works. And then in type 3, you're probably looking at partners and outsourcing and bringing in expertise to help make an integrated product actually work. So after you do the hard work of carefully defining or designing an MVP approach, then you just have to build it. Simple, right? Not really, but there are several strategies that we can look at here that will help you actually build an MVP. I broke it down into three things. You can piece it together. You can use a platform as a service or software as a service, or a phased development approach. So there are lots of open source vendor provided components that you can use to stand up a simple MVP. And there's an increasing number of like great IoT ready off the shelf hardware components as well. Examples are an Arduino, Raspberry Pi, Particle, BeagleBone, Espressif, ESP32. There's probably 100. In our experience, these are there's not a direct path through to a high level production system based simply on wiring these components together with open source software components, but you can absolutely be the right place to start. To take things to the sort of next sort of logical step, or sometimes in combination with some of those off-the-shelf IoT-ready hardware bits and pieces, you can look at pulling in an IoT platform as a service or a software as a service. These platforms and software packages, they're usually commercial, usually paid. There are some open source versions too. It's a big universe, but can absolutely be leveraged to build an MVP and a production system for that matter. In some cases, these are a great way to prove out core concepts without investing in significant custom development in an early MVP stage. IoT Analytics reported that there are 613 companies offering IoT platforms in 2021. So there are a lot of options, and it's almost impossible to keep up with all of them. So IoT platforms vary widely in capabilities, but they typically focus on one or more building blocks of an IoT system, like physical devices, internet connectivity, digital services. In one way or another, they provide software, sometimes hardware too, that gives companies a head start when building an IoT system. So the goal here of an IoT platform is to provide a foundation for product makers to build IoT solutions on top of it. And they oftentimes will take care of a lot of the fundamental features and sort of backbone or plumbing that you would need in your system. So you can focus on those kind of user value driven features on top of that. So using an IoT platform can give you a huge benefit from economies of scale, especially if you're using some of the most popular platforms. There's some really big players, obviously, in this space. And that can improve into increased security, more robust services, and lower initial costs. So sometimes, though, using a platform as a service or a SaaS solution isn't really the right strategy or doesn't align with the long-term goals, product goals, or organizational goals that you may have. There's a lot of nuances there. I don't really have the time to get into all that today, but that's an area that Spindance does consult in. There can be a lot of variables to weigh when you look at how integrating with a platform may have implications in the long term for your product and organization. So, but in the case when it's determined that it's not a good fit, or if you do an MVP and then you think, and then just determine that it's good for the MVP and it was successful, but now it's time to kind of move past that into a more customized solution. Another way that we oftentimes do things is with a phased approach, which is done by carefully breaking the product down into phases, so the team can efficiently develop towards particular release points. So common phases might include a roadmap and a proof of concept or MVP, an early MVP, road mapping, design, a design phase, an MVP development phase, and then maybe a production 1.0 phase, followed by subsequent phases. There's a lot of flexibility in how you break something down. It's obviously highly dependent on the product and the project and all that. But the idea being, you break it down into components, you execute really hard against those phases so that you can test in increments along the way. So this is actually how we structured the Seagull project that I talked about a couple times. We developed a phased plan and laid it out at the beginning. So we started with a design phase, then we moved into MVP development and launch, and then we moved into it was like a beta release and then a production release, and now we're in maintenance and improvement. So it will be followed by subsequent rounds of development and release as well. So yeah, so by carefully developing and protecting an MVP phase, you can do two things. You can get the advantages of leveraging the learnings from an MVP, and you can also sometimes get advantages in setting a direction for the long-term development if you kind of lay things out at the beginning with a long view. So another approach, or really one that we almost always or oftentimes combine with a phased approach, is to use a starter kit of components. So after years of designing and developing custom IoT solutions, we found that the backlog at the beginning of almost every IoT product was very similar to the one before. In almost all cases, we had to build the same or very similar foundation for most products. So we learned a lot of lessons over the years doing that, repeating and improving upon these patterns, developing a set of best practices, and designing the skeleton components for an end-to-end IoT solution. So we decided along the way to start using our design templates to take it a step further by developing a collection of components that we call our starter kit. We found that by utilizing these foundational components, it usually saves us months of effort through the course of a large IoT deployment. It allows domain specialists and engineers to really hit the ground running and start delivering feature-based or value-based features very quickly. It prevents redundancy and reduces risk. It also can pull the MVP release way forward in the timeline. It's possible to have an MVP in weeks instead of months if you use an approach like this. So once you have released an MVP product, your focus really then turns to the next iteration, whether that's another MVP, subsequent phase of development, or targeting a production development phase. So remember, one of the keys for defining an MVP was to make it targeted. And this is where we kind of close the loop on that. You'll want to have a plan for how to get your MVP into the hands of your target user group and how you're going to get information back out of them. So to revisit the Seagull project again, after we launched the MVP via private beta, we started getting user feedback on the core features, and also new feature requests started flowing in as well. This allowed us to start incorporating that feedback into the product well before the production release. For Seagull, our client developed a plan on how to get their early adopters to start using the MVP version, which we knew would turn into valuable feedback. So they did paid UX testing, they did focus groups, and we obviously designed the front end to generate feedback from us, from the users. So now I just want to take a quick look at how this changes the dynamic of a product development team or development team. I'm assuming some knowledge here of agile development. If you don't, I apologize. But when you start a project in an agile development kind of ecosystem, there's a really tight loop between the stakeholders and the development team. The communication is really circular and it's really tight. And it's designed to be that way. And that's one of the things that makes it agile. This is really powerful, and it can help a team focus and actually get something built. So it's a really powerful thing. It's a reason that we use agile, one of the reasons. It also can have an insulating effect. So during this phase, there's really not a lot of outside input. So you've effectively gotten rid of the distractions, which is a good thing for the product development process. It brings a lot of efficiency to the team, increases developer satisfaction, increases code quality, all those kind of things. But you'll notice that you don't really have any critical outside input coming into the team. So once you launch an MVP, this will change, hopefully, a lot. If your test plan is solid and well executed, you'll have lots of useful and likely some not so useful feedback coming from your users. And this will effectively pop that isolation bubble. This phase really requires careful management, something that a good lead engineer and product owner can help you with. If you don't have careful management, all of this input will become noise and distractions, and your team will struggle to make progress. But if it's managed well, it can actually be an accelerant for your product, and it can serve as a guide on how to create more value for your users and move you forward in a larger product development lifecycle. So that brings up a good question. How do you know when it's time to move past an MVP? Making MVP products can be a lot of fun, but at some point, someone's probably going to ask you to make a production version of something. And so there's no one answer to this, when is it the right time, but at a basic level, when you think, or better yet, when your data confirms that you have a solid problem solution fit, then it's time to move past an MVP. Some things that we might look for in that time would be, did you validate your MVP hypotheses? Can you demonstrate that you have a product market fit? Not just can you think that you do, but can you actually demonstrate it? And then do you have a technical path forward? Doesn't mean that you know the full solution. In fact, you shouldn't, otherwise you're doing too much design work ahead of time. And it doesn't mean there's no technical risk left, but your team should be able to articulate a technical path forward, at least on the core features of your product. So then you kind of have to make a plan for how to make a transition from an MVP product to a 1.0 or production version. How this goes will likely depend on a number of factors. What type of MVP did you test with? If you built a type 1 MVP, do you remember that's like a, that's really high level UX focused. You're going to have more development steps likely to validate functionality and form factor and hardware choices, et cetera. You're going to have more steps in the process between that MVP being successfully completed and a production version. On the other hand, if you have a solid level 3 MVP, there may be less steps because you may have a lot of those things sort of at least partially validated, like the form factor, and some hardware choices are probably mostly locked in by then. It may not be less work, but it's probably less steps to get to a production version from there. It'll also be greatly impacted by how you built the MVP product. If you piece it together, then you're likely looking at kind of starting the development process from the beginning. You're building on the learnings, but you're probably not building on the same code base or hardware packages. On the other hand, if you used a phased approach and you had a solid combination of, platform as a service and starter components, you may be able to roll some of that or a lot of that work forward into a subsequent development phase that gets you moving towards production. It's really highly dependent on the situation. Obviously, there's lots of scenarios in between those two that could be a case. But in any case, it's really critically important that you consider the MVP as a critical step in the product development process, and that it will really set your team up to successfully launch a production version. And it's especially the case in an area like IoT, where the products can be complex and the user experience is not straightforward. We see that a lot at Spindance. When you start to really dig into the user experience of an IoT product, it's really complicated, and it requires testing and feedback from real users, because the way that a product designer or a product owner or an engineer might understand and see a product really might not land the same with users who don't have all the context for it. So at Spindance, we love working on MVPs of all kinds and all levels. So if there's anything we can do to support you and your team and your MVP or beyond, please reach out. So that wraps up what I have today. So Max, I think we're ready to move on to the Q&A portion.
Hey Daniel, thanks so much. Yes, it's time for our Q&A session. So we've got questions coming in. Well, the first one is one of those, how long is a piece of string? How long does it take to make an MVP product?
Yeah, I think you're right. It'd be hard to give a really precise answer to that. But I think, depending on how you design your MVP, that can be wildly variable. But I think the more simple and targeted you can make an MVP, the closer you can pull that forward. There obviously are going to be some products that have, technical intricacies or requirements, or are trying to solve a problem that's unusually complex. Those just probably require more time. But I think how you structure your MVP is really the main factor in how quickly you can do it. So.
I do like the idea of layering things on as you go. Okay, so here's a question. Can you speak a bit more about designing for multiple personas/users, especially if their job functions are functionally different or varied?
Yeah, that is, I think, one of the core things from from my experience with IoT is that makes it fundamentally more interesting or difficult than lots of different types of software development, because you have potentially so many different kinds of users that are all trying to access the same system, but have wildly variable ideas of what the product does, what they want it to do, etc. Like Seagull actually is a fine example of that. We designed this around serving multiple types of users. So if you think about like a scientist who manages a fleet of data collection equipment in the lakes, that person has way different expectations for what a platform like this should do, what's useful, and then somebody who is about to go out on their boat and just wants to know if their brother's going to get sick because the waves are too big, or if it's safe, or et cetera, or if they want to go to the beach and know how warm the water is. It's not easy. We partnered with design professionals, UX designers who are experienced in the IoT world, because there are nuances there that not any designer would know right off the hand. There's some lessons that you learn the hard way through the iterative development process, through like launching a design or doing some paid UX testing, and finding out, yeah, my users don't get it. Yeah, so I think, you know, there was a really complicated product. You might actually even look at doing multiple parallel MVPs. That's a strategy that you could do. Make them as simple and targeted as possible and run 2 at the same time if you have 2 different groups of users, and then try to get the learning that you need done to build design the product. So.
Okay, well, we've got one question that says, does an MVP, and then it stops. So I think we'll wait for that to be filled out in a bit more detail. And another question for me, will a recording of this event be available? Yes, a recording of the event will be available later on, possibly. I don't know if it's immediately after the webinar, but by tomorrow at the latest. I'll find out and let you know about that in a minute. This one, if I didn't know this has come from the outside world, I'd think you'd posted it yourself. What services do you offer to help organizations with this MVP process? I think this person is keen on progressing more.
Yep, no, it's a fair question. Yeah, so yeah, Spindance offers, we do development, obviously, and we work on a lot of MVP development process or projects as well. So we'll do development or in partnership with our clients to develop an MVP product. And so we obviously can supply the development capacity for that, like the engineers and developers and whatnot to actually make that happen. We also provide some front-end consulting services like product road mapping, innovation workshops. We'll do software assessments or system assessments on if your organization or team has an existing product or a parallel product or something like that you want to make a connected version of or make a new version of or something like that. If there's some baseline that you're working from, we can look at that. If it's a brand new product, we can run different workshops and road mapping kind of services around that to help clarify and articulate, like, what is this, what are you trying to do, and identify what the right next steps are. So we do engagements as small as, like, my organization or my team needs help developing a really simple MVP prototype, to solve this or to test this hypothesis. Or like in the case of Gloss, like, we kind of know the arc here, we know where it ends, but we need to iteratively develop our way there. And so let's lay out a phased approach to get there. And we have a number of services that kind of can help in each of those phases along the way. So.
Okay, this is a quick one, I think. The question is the goal of MVP also to stop early? And I think that means, is one of the goals of creating an MVP to do it really quickly?
Could be.
Use that as a go, no go type thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, if the goal of an MVP is learning and to test hypothesis, the answer might be no. or the answer might not be what you expected it to be. And that's actually a good thing, because that means that you only invested an MVP's worth of money and time and resources and energy into something before you find that out. So again, it's not comfortable, it's not a fun experience, but it's actually really good from a product development experience. And you may see times when you test a hypothesis or test a product MVP, you get that no from your users, like this isn't anything, like we don't want this. It could be that the idea is way off. It could be the small tweak in how you implemented the MVP, and it could change that dynamic really quickly. And so that's actually, yeah, it's a good point. You want to see that. You want to try to get that no, and then when you can't, then you know you're onto something.
Okay, this is not so much a question, it's a statement, but possibly you could address it. Agile works best with software products. When the critical value of a product is tied to hardware development as well, then Agile will only address part of the MVP journey.
So, Agile is most commonly and most appropriately applied in software development. That's, probably a true statement. Hardware is much more tricky you can't just slap Scrum on a hardware development project and expect it to work well, because hardware is physical. The learning and iterative, the development loops are longer and different than they are in the software world. I think the hardware where that starts to overlay is when you look at the whole product development lifecycle as an iterative development process, not necessarily saying Scrum in that sense. That's how you would manage the software development piece. But if you're looking at the whole product development cycle as an iterative project, right, where you're doing quick loops and testing and learning and changing along the way, I think that's where we would see that overlay with the hardware development process. So we have a lot of experience with that. I personally understand the intricacies and the challenges that come along with that, for sure. It's not simple, but working to integrate a hardware development process and cycle in alongside of product development is where that kind of rubber really meets the road. So, yep.
Okay, another one that if I wasn't seeing them coming in, I think we were posting them ourselves. Does Spindance also consult on the connectivity type? There are many connectivity technologies in the IoT, Wi-Fi, LoRa, cellular. I imagine the Seedle project required long-range wireless connectivity.
Yep, so two questions there. Yes, we definitely do. We work on products and projects that use lots of different connectivity technologies, Bluetooth, cellular, and like you mentioned, long range, low power protocols as well. Thread, and other IoT, like home IoT kind of protocols as well. The Seagull project requires a few different things. A lot of the platforms use a cellular connection, and then we kind of ingest from there. So we have a number of different ingest points on the Seagull platform, so we can ingest from different types of connections. It's really a platform approach. So there's a lot of different ways to get data into a platform like that, which include multiple connectivity technologies and tech stacks, all the way from the device in the field through the actual transmission and communication to how it's received in the cloud and how it's shared with users. So, yep.
Okay, we've got time for a couple, I think, more questions. Apart from the page UX strategy and focus and user interviews method, could another method be to make a workshop with the stakeholders to define who is the persona or user, I guess?
Yeah, I think if I understand the question, then I would say yes. I think that's a great tool. We use a lot of different types of workshops in a design or in a product development process. So definitely workshopping with your stakeholders and with your users, especially if you're working on an early MVP and you've got like a group of innovators that you know have an understanding of the problem space, like workshopping with them can be incredibly valuable. You can skip whole iterations if you can get a handful of people in a room or on a call for a few hours and really just say, this is what we're doing, what do you think, and kind of work through that. So I think absolutely lots of workshops to engage different sets of stakeholders and users before and during your MVP process. Absolutely.
Okay, a couple of quick ones. How many users should be part of testing an MVP, and where do you find the users for testing an MVP?
Yep. So as far as the number of users, I think that depends on the product. If you're going to launch a product and you're going to sell 1 million of them, you probably want to have more than 5 people test it, because you're going to, in your 1 million end users, you're going to have a huge diversity of people and use cases and expectations and contexts, and somebody's going to use it on some 15-year-old device, and all that kind of stuff. So you're going to want to test on a larger bed of users. If you're designing a really niche solution that's going to have 10 people who use it, then you can probably just test with all 10 of them, honestly, and really understand what you're building. So I think it depends a little bit on the context for the product, but I think it scales based on kind of the end vision for the product a bit. As far as how do you find them, I think again that depends a bit. If you've got an early product, you're early in the adoption life cycle, I think, like I said, you've got to find those groups of innovators who they may understand the problem space better than you do. There could be groups that you can find that are already trying to address it with DIY type of hacks or solutions. There could be a particular slice of your set of users that may have a particular attribute that makes them particularly useful in that kind of phase. So I think really trying to figure that out, that requires some research and kind of careful, I think, thinking about who your users are and who might actually really give you the input that you need at the right time. Yeah, and if you're looking at a kind of much broader product, I think then you're kind of looking more at a more paid UX research, more focus groups, those kind of things to really bring in, there are services that can help with, even bringing that kind of those people and users and input to the table. So.
Okay, right, we're running out of time now. We've got time for just one more question. In the case of all the questions we've not got around to answering, Daniel will be answering you directly at the email address you provided when you registered for the webinar. And while I ask this final question, Daniel's told me that you can feel free to contact him directly using the contact details shown on your screen. So final question, Daniel, speedy answer. What do I do if my company's leadership expects an MVP to be the first version of a production product?
Yep, that's very common. We run into that all the time, where MVP really just means the first version. I'm going to sell a whole bunch of them, right? And that's particularly challenging. So I think I mentioned earlier the concept of a minimum viable test is another way to kind of say some of the same thing. So finding a way to communicate what you think your team needs to do to validate your hypothesis early and often, I think is the key there.
Okay, thank you, Daniel. That was really interesting. I learned a lot there. I'll be talking about this to everyone I know now. Okay, so this brings today's webinar to a close. I'd like to thank everyone for attending and give a special thanks once again to Spin Dance for their sponsorship, and a special to Daniel for his insightful presentation. Once again, this is Clive Maxfield. I'm very pleased to have been your host for today's event. I look forward to seeing you all again at the next IoT Central webinar. And until then, from all of us here at IoT Central, we hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.